and welcome to Daily Debrief brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Pragya and today we bring you an update from Ukraine, the implications of US military aid and controversy over a security pact between Solomon Islands and China. Russia has declared victory in the battle for Mariupol and it has decided to blockade the steel mill where 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers are said to be holed up. Reports say Russia is trying to take full control over the port city. It has said its next step would be to take control over eastern and southeastern Ukraine. That may help it create a land corridor that links pro-Russian regions in the east with the Crimea. We have Prabir Purkais with us to discuss these developments. Prabir, the endgames were said to be denazification, demilitarization. Is Russia getting any closer to those targets?
Well, I don't think denazification is a short-term target. By its very nature, it means looking at the Ukrainian society and the political forces there. And that's certainly not something which is going to change rapidly. So what Russia means by denazification, which they would be satisfied with, is something that we'll have to see. What is it that a negotiation can achieve? But demilitarization effectively means the destruction of the military capabilities of the Ukrainian security forces. Now, as far as we can see, a large part of it has been achieved. Of course, the military still exists, it still can fight, that is true, but its mobility seems to have been badly affected. Also, if we look at, for instance, how can the supplies of arms and ammunition reach the front, which is now increasingly clear is the Eastern Front. That is where the battles are going on, the Donbass-Lugansk region, the Donbass region, then also the east of the Dnieper River. This seems to be the way things are shaping up. So if we look at that, the Ukrainian army is static. It doesn't seem to have much mobility. And that also comes from the fact that, after all, it requires fuel for movement. And fuel is something which is already in short supply. Only 1/3 of the gas pumps seem to be working there, from what reports we are getting. And if we look at also large-scale troop movements, I don't think that it's very easy to reach fuel supplies to them. That means those who are in the eastern sector, particularly in the Donbass region, those formations do not have, therefore, too much mobility. Therefore, it's possible for Russia to somehow piecemeal swallow them up or defeat them, which is what their intention seems to be. And Russian military strategies have this, forming cauldrons, surrounding, grinding. Russia doesn't do blitzkrieg kind of attacks. That's not their military dictionary, so to say. And that expectation that they will do what would the Americans call shock and awe, that also doesn't seem to be their method. So I think we are talking really of very different kinds of attacks. Now, when you talk about United States in Mosul, they fought for 10 months for something like 8,000 Al-Qaeda, ISIS supporters. Okay. Now, that's the kind of battles that when you enter really built-up areas, you might have to undergo. In Mariupol, they seem to have done it in a much quicker time. So given that, we must also understand that Ukrainian forces, the armed forces in the east, are also not having the support or sympathy of the local population, and that itself helps Russia in their attempt to interdict and immobilize the Ukrainian army, Ukrainian armed forces, and also probably destroy them piecemeal. So I think if you look at it this way, as taking away Ukraine's military capabilities, I think that is on target. What is the calendar? Putin has never announced a calendar. We must be very clear. These calendars have been announced by the Western powers. He thought it will be done in a week. Kyiv will fall in a week, 2 weeks. That's what Russia expected. They've been totally, shocked by this. It doesn't seem to be borne out by what we can read of the war. So we will leave it. We are not experts,
right.
And of course, as we know, the United States, shall we say, the news organizations seem to have become vocal mouthpieces of the US foreign policy, or the mouthpieces of the US security agencies, both of which do not really encourage a great deal of confidence in their views either. So given that these are all conflicting views, I think that there is a time frame which Russia has, which they have not announced. But the time frame also means what is the Ukrainian government going to do? They came close to an agreement. Russia pulled out of the Kiev region because of that. Then it seems to have gone back to square zero again. So given that, it will depend, the denazification depends on what the West does and what the Zelensky government does. And let's face it, this is not a war between Ukraine and Russia. This is now really a war between NATO and Russia being fought in Ukraine. And I think that's the basic thing we have to understand, because the entire military support that they're getting, including probably satellite pictures and other things, are coming from NATO's forces.
On a related note, we move on to the question of proliferation of weapons. With respect to this war, the US and its allies have been actively arming the Ukrainians. On Thursday, US President Joe Biden announced around $800 million in military assistance to Ukraine, following $2.6 billion in such aid that has previously been announced. And interestingly, the German Chancellor has said that the top priority is to prevent a conflict between NATO and Russia. So we go back to Prabir. Prabir, first of all, how do you explain this statement by the German Chancellor of avoiding conflict?
Well, it's, as you have pointed out, this is ironical, because the time they're saying we should avoid conflict is the time that huge amounts of military arms, and the latest arms, these are not old arms, that means they've been lying around for Soviet Union times, or in the time when Eastern Europe was with the Soviet Union. These are all, a lot of them are latest weapons, which the earlier NATO countries were not willing to give. They were saying, we can't give those weapons. Now, from Javelin anti-tank missiles to all kinds of other equipment, switchblade, drones, various other advanced equipment is being poured into Ukraine. There is also, it seems, enough evidence to show that their NATO countries or NATO forces are playing a more active role in guiding what Ukraine military should or shouldn't do. Where should it attack? What are the Russians doing? Making available on real-time basis information from the satellite imagery and other information that they have. So they are sort of on ground with Ukraine in some form or the other. So to claim that this should not become something between NATO and Russia, I think that is well past it. They are very much on the ground, NATO. And from what we hear also, a lot of the so-called volunteers who had come to fight in Ukraine are also essentially NATO forces under the guise of being volunteers. So if we take all of this picture into account, it does seem that NATO is very much on the ground, though not officially. The countries are officially not fighting, the soldiers are officially not fighting, and the Ukrainians are fighting. So this is the story that is there. Of course, as you know, it's all fog of war, so we don't know what is really happening on the ground. But there are stories that even the Ukraine army today is being led by NATO officers, except they're all volunteers, supposedly. Okay, so these are all, again, this is the fog of war. But what we do know is a huge amount of arms and weapons are coming into Ukraine. But the problem that they have is, first, it's all right for it to come into Ukraine. How do you transfer it to the front lines when your own forces are immobilized, when you don't have that kind of say, ability to move it through rail or through trucks? And if you do, you're open to then airstrikes by the Russian forces. So there is that issue which is there. And the fact that this huge amount of arms that have come in are either being blown up much too rapidly by the Ukrainian forces, or Russia has been able to interdict them and bomb it as they have done in Lvov, and they have done earlier also as well. The storage facilities are being hit. Or, as some people have claimed, there is also a thriving black market in which these weapons are already being put into. As you know, Ukraine is not exactly the best run country in the world. There are criminal gangs, and of course this can also go into Western Europe in the criminal network, or in the hands of the far right, which is very much there in Europe. And the Ukrainian forces increasingly on the ground it seems to be under the influence of the far right. So these are the dangers that are there. And if we see that, if we take these dangers into account, I will say that though NATO may say we don't want to get into a war with Russia, but they're letting the trigger of these things also fall into the hands who actually want a war with Russia. So what will happen? Anybody's guess.
Okay.
Is NATO burning through its arms and ammunition? Yes. In fact, some of the people have said that even we have not calculated so much will be gone. Bloomberg has a report which says 1/3 of US inventory in some of these items have been depleted by supplying it to Ukraine. And the war is only, how many, 50 days, 60
Yes.
days old. So in this condition, that how much of such arms and ammunition can be continue to be supplied without risking the US security itself has also been raised by some of the experts. I think we have to see both these things into account to say that yes, NATO is very much at the moment involved, and it is no longer what it was in the first month of war, and this doesn't portend very well for the future.
Is there a risk here, a threat of proliferation of weapons?
Proliferation of weapons are happening freely on the ground. We have seen earlier in Libya, for instance, what happened when weapons were pumped into Libya. They went all over the world. We have seen wherever the US has supplied weapons, it has come back to hit them as well. So this is not something new, but what it does is destabilizes regions. So in West Asia or in Afghanistan, these kind of arms don't get limited to only the particular area that you've supplied it to. So if Ukraine is supplied with a huge number of arms and in the hands which are not responsible, then let me put it this way, the far right controlling the Ukrainian army or the Ukrainian security forces, it's a huge threat to Europe as well. So, fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian may seem a very attractive proposition to the United States, which is across the Atlantic. But for the rest of Europe, this seems to be suicidal. But at the same time, their animosity towards Russia, some of them, and to some others who are so closely in bed with the United States, they don't seem to be able to take what would be a rational policy in their own interest.
Right, Prabir. Thanks very much for that update. The small Pacific nation of Solomon Islands is on the radar for an emerging Cold War. Earlier this week, the Chinese government declared it has signed a security deal with the government of the Solomon Islands. This has alarmed the Western powers and their allies in the Pacific, including Australia and New Zealand. The US does not want a Chinese military base to come up in the region. The Solomon Islands was in the headlines last November after anti-Chinese riots in its most populous province. Anish from People's Dispatch has been following developments in this case. Anish, what do we know about the Chinese role in this area, and why is there such a big conflict over it?
So I think one of the first things that Western powers in general and like US and Australia and also New Zealand now in specific are concerned about is that apparently they believe China will be building a base in Solomon Islands. Now Solomon Islands is quite close to both Australia and New Zealand, so they're kind of concerned that there will be a Chinese military projection in South Pacific. Whether or not that is going to happen is something that we can only know if the final copy of the bill, which has been the treaty which has been signed between the two countries, once that comes out, that is when we can actually tell if that's a possibility. But there was a leaked draft that came out, and if we go through that leaked draft, there is no talks about setting up a base. There are talks about deployment of police, deployment of armed police and law enforcement, and even armed military personnel to Solomon Islands by China only if Solomon Islands government requests for it and gives consent to it. Even the most basic fact like sending replenishment shipments to Solomon Islands has to be done with the consent of the government there. and cannot be done by China unilaterally. Any dispute has to be done with both countries in favor of it. So it has to be a very bilateral decision, and that is something that has been emphasized throughout this copy that we know. We do not know if this draft copy is there is no way to verify if it's the copy that we are talking about, and if this was the final copy that the two countries signed. That it will be made public in a few months, we believe, but this is where we are at, and what we see is just a very strong reaction coming out from Western powers, simply because they assumed for a very long time that the South Pacific and Pacific in general is pretty much their sphere of influence. And so they do not really want any kind of Chinese influence in the region, and it's not just the military influence that they fear, but also even developmental influence that China has played in places like Papua New Guinea, Fiji, and now even Solomon Islands recently. And this is something that threatens their position in the place. We have to remember that because of this so-called Chinese overtures that they claim to have happened, it is only after that that the United States is now trying to re-establish full diplomatic relations with Solomon Islands. It did not have an embassy for nearly more than 3 decades now, and it is now setting up a high-level delegation for diplomatic relations in that country. So it has completely ignored it until it believed that suddenly China is going to be a significant partner, if not, posing threat to its own interest in the region.
So, Anish, what would China's role in the country really look like? What would be the role that it plays?
It is very difficult to say, because we have to remember that the two nations have only established relations for 3 years now. It was in 2019 that the Solomon Islands finally recognized the People's Republic of China as the China, as per the One China policy, and it was only, I think, the 180th country. So it is quite a recent, very new kind of development in the country's history. And so the relationship is something that needs to be developed. We know diplomacy is not something that can be done overnight. Neither can any kind of relationships emerge. Right now, this whole thing with the Security Pact only came up after the riot that we witnessed last year in November, and which targeted Chinese citizens, Chinese nationals, and their establishments in the region. And this is the only reason why such a security pact was even considered in the first place between the two countries, because China does want to protect its own interest, its people, and its businesses in other places. And if it requires certain level of if necessary, but like very limited military deployment, it would do so. And we have seen that in the case of Eritrea, where China built a fueling base, but a military base, its first military base overseas, but as a fueling base for its shipments, and also for protection for its shipments through the Red Sea. Now, that was to protect its interest, its business networks, from piracy, which has been a major issue in the Horn of Africa, as we all know. So it is very similar sort of situation here, because as we know, like the Chinatown area in Malaita was targeted, in Honiara it was targeted, and like many houses were just razed to the ground. And these were, many of them were obviously Chinese nationals, but also citizens of Solomon Islands. So this was a sort of targeted attack by reactionary forces who have not only opposed relations with China, but who have also very vehemently supported US presence, military presence even, in Solomon Islands. So China's role in the region, and in Solomon Islands in particular, is something that it is too soon to be spoken about, because we do not have much details about anything. Even this pact, we are not very sure what the final form of the whole deal will look like and how it works out. But as far as we know, it is nothing on the scale that the alarmists are trying to portray. We have already seen war hawks trying to talk about invading Solomon Islands if necessary to do away with the deal. But at the same time, there are developmental issues, and this is not something that we see in Solomon Islands, but throughout the region and throughout the Third World, where they have sought Chinese assistance in various developmental projects. And this has only rattled Western powers because their influence starts waning. The whole dependency on aid stops coming out, and establishing equal relations on, for development, for progress, is something that obviously rattles the former colonial power, who looks at the world as different spheres that they can influence. So
Right.
definitely is something that is happening right now. The Cold War, as we know, the kind of encirclement that is already happening against China by the US in the region, not just in South Pacific, but also in its immediate neighborhood, is already just present. But we need to, again, everything is way too soon. Nothing is concrete at this point, so we need to really wait and see.
Got it. Thanks a lot, Anish, for that update. And that is all we have today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. Do come back to us tomorrow and follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, and read us on www.peoplesdispatch.org.